Developing the Leader Within podcast, leading beyond limits.
Welcome back, everyone. If you haven't subscribed, please do so right now, as it'll help us get our show to others and help us get to our next milestone. Today, I'm excited to be speaking with Raquel García. Raquel is a senior policy developer. She has previously led cyber policy portfolios for the Secretary of the Navy. Thank you for that. And analytical programs for the U.S. Air Force. She is an experienced chief of staff and legislative analyst with outstanding skills focusing on foreign policy and defense. Raquel, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Enrique, for having me here. Very excited to have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for having it with me. And folks, we'll be speaking about why the best leaders think like diplomats. And most don't, right? So before we get into that conversation, Raquel, tell us a little bit about you that maybe the audience doesn't know.
Well, some things that our listeners may not know about me. I think it is well known that I spent my first third of my life in Spain. So that really gave me a first-hand master understanding of Europe. That's how I call it. So when we hear things about Europe right now, anything from health systems to geopolitical relationships between states, I lived it firsthand. And then maybe a couple of things that the audience may not know about me is that from the very beginning, I showed an interest in science. So I was a pre-med student. I did all of my biochemistry engineering courses. I really wanted to work in that area, that arena of the weapons biochemistry engineering. And once medical school seemed a bit too lengthy for me, I steered towards becoming a linguist, which is what I eventually ended up being. And I think lastly, I was a U.S. military spouse for almost a decade. So that brought me a wealth of experience because, again, I lived it firsthand. Anything from lost furniture to enrolling the kids in pre-K, to spouse employment, to financial legal hardships that one goes through. Everything, I've lived it. It's not that I read about it. So I always say that with great pride.
That trajectory is lovely. I'll tell you, sometimes we don't understand how life was going to take us, but going from medical and all the things that you did, and thank you for being what I consider the most integral part of the military family, which is the spouse that is underappreciated.
I agree.
And under-recognized. So, but before we get into our conversation, I just want to remind everybody that today's conversation is solely Raquel's own personal experience and comments and do not reflect in any way the views of her professional organization or anyone that she is working with. So get that out of the way so that we can have the conversation on diplomacy, policy making. We know that through our experience and at the levels that we have served and you are currently serving, diplomacy and policy making are one of the things that are very powerful to a leader, but if not understood or mishandled, could be very detrimental for leaders. So from your work shaping cyber and defense policy at the highest levels, what diplomatic skills do leaders need most in 2026 to influence outcomes when they don't have formal authority, but do have the responsibility?
Well, that's a great question because if you're a leader with responsibility but no formal authority, I think you need to shift your mindset from command to one of influence. And influence is the art of what I call principle compromise, because when you don't have the authority, you can't give orders. You have to negotiate. So this requires a low ego, which is not the same as having low confidence. You can have that confidence, But you need to focus on the mission rather than who gets the credit for it. I think that's also a good shift. I think other critical diplomatic skills are to build a coalition of sorts within the organization and to be able as a leader to translate. So I think we are all used to that hierarchy, pyramid, top-down leadership style. But in the world that we're living in right now, I see that it's better to look at a leadership framework that is based on what I call the center of a network. You are at the center and you need to relate or establish those relationships with private industry, with academia, with other departments. So that requires to have that soft power that gets really emphasized by all the digital platforms. I think digital platforms have revolutionized diplomacy because they allow leaders to engage directly with global audiences. They bypass the traditional media gatekeepers, and this real-time engagement is a powerful tool for countering disinformation and demonstrating transparency. I think it also gives us narrative control against our adversaries. So in the world of diplomacy, the digital transformation has been great. Another point that I would highlight about these diplomacy skills is to have some type of credibility, and that credibility requires fluency. So when we're talking about AI or cybersecurity, one doesn't have to be a coder. In fact, some cases I think it's better if you are not, but you have to have an understanding of that language of technology and risk to make those informed decisions. You need to understand that world of strategy and what is the strategic cost for policy makers, and bring those together when we are looking at cyber warfare or espionage, or to make those informed decisions. So I think probably to have those, that direct access when we are talking about interacting with the audience, and to have that center network as a framework for leadership, that gets you to a yes most of the times. And that's what the real power is. That's when leaders find out that the real power isn't granted by your title, but it's really most earned through their influence.
Absolutely. I have known that as I experienced senior leadership in the Navy, that sometimes you don't have the position, sometimes you don't have that title, but you sure do have this thing called influence, and it makes things work. Oftentimes, the policy seems slow, right? And we know we get these directives that come out and they're slow and complex to operational leaders. Now, based on your experience with the Department of the Navy and the Air
Mhm.
Force, how can leaders better translate policy into decisive action without losing strategic intent or trust?
I think what my experience has shown me is oftentimes the gap between complex policy and decisive action, what I call that strategic friction, it has to do with the leader sometimes, or not translating and being the shock absorber, what I call, for their teams. So you have dense policy language and a clear intent. So in my case, because I come from the operational world, writing strategic, operational, foreign, or cyber policy in such a way comes naturally, but it's a skill that takes decades of experience to acquire. So what I would recommend is you don't need to focus on the what or the why, but you really have to distill the why. What is the ultimate goal of this policy? but more importantly, I would say, what does success look like? You have a 100-page document. Instead of just taking it as dogma, at the end of this document, what would be a successful mission? Focus on that. And once the why is clear, you as the leader, you can decentralize the how. So give your team the ability to operate without micromanaging, because you have SMEs, you have very experienced, enlisted senior leaders that they know how to put into action that policy. So micromanaging is another hurdle that I think we need to definitely get rid of if we can. Let them handle the how. Just offer some operational boundaries, and you tell them you have the freedom to operate within these left and right limits. Just do not cross these lines without escalating it at my level to prevent catastrophic errors and maintain that strategic policy alignment. And I think secondly, to simplify that complex policy, we need to make sure as leaders that we create feedback loops. I think we are pretty good at establishing formal channels for feedback. We have regular training meetings, syncs, assessments. But with the informal feedback, sometimes I think we need to improve that aspect. What I mean by that is, I don't think I've ever encountered a leader that likes to hear straight from the source what is really going on, because it hurts your ego, because you take it sometimes as, wow, are you criticizing the way I'm doing things? But I think there is a very humble aspect of being a leader, and to allow the source to tell you directly what's going on, because we all have gatekeepers. The gatekeepers keep sending back that very useful feedback. You need to follow the chain of command. You need to, follow these protocols, and feedback gets diluted. So I would say, in order for a policy to be successful, don't be afraid as a leader to have those informal moments of direct from the source feedback. I think they're extremely valuable for that.
I agree. As a senior enlisted, I remember the commanding officers having a box outside of the main admin
Indeed.
area, right? And
Yes.
anyone could write, whatever, and put it in there, and then, it would make it to the CO's desk. Good, bad, ugly, indifferent.
Indeed.
It just did, and it was a good vehicle to get some inkling into what was being said, what was the mentality of the crew at the time to anything, right? It could have been morale, welfare, whatever. But it was a good approach at giving that instant access without, being in the office, knocking
Right.
and saying, I need to say this, but giving the commanding officer an opportunity to see how his policies were truly impacting the workforce, in this case, the sailors. So, yeah.
And also I would add lastly, because you were saying, how does a complex policy really, gets into place. Um, we shouldn't forget the importance of the resources allocated as well. Sometimes the disconnect between a good policy implementation is we don't have the resources allocated. And to be fair, nobody wants to call the baby ugly, right? Nobody wants to go to the boss and say, hey, this is great, but I don't have the personnel, the training, the equipment. When resources are insufficient, those conversations, sometimes they are not very well spelled out, and we just keep doing things the way we are doing things because nobody wants to raise that flag. And unfortunately, coming from my policy background, sometimes the policy is not bad. The policy has everything in it to be successful. It's more the execution portion of it, whether it's the feedback, the resources that sometimes makes it not viable.
Yeah, you're right. And oftentimes, if I am consulting a company on their policies, one of the first questions I ask is, are you willing to support this
Right.
from this point on? And they're like, what do you mean? Yeah, I wrote it. No, 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 no. Are you willing to give it all it needs to be successful? Because if you're just writing something for the sake of writing, you might as well take it down, right? And
Exactly.
so, yeah, perfect, perfect. Now, you've operated at the intersection of military, intelligence, diplomacy,
Yes.
and even private industry. How should leaders think differently about the diplomacy inside their organizations, not just between nations, in an era of constant disruption and cyber risk?
For me, the most resilient organizations that I've witnessed in my professional career were those that didn't have the tallest firewalls, those that they had the strongest internal connective tissue. They were very successful. And I think the primary vector for catastrophic failure is oftentimes not a technical vulnerability as we think, but more an organizational one. So having that internal diplomatic approach, I think it can improve resilience and agility. Um, this was a culture shock for me, still is many days, coming from that diplomatic or private sector world, when I encounter sometimes the rigidity of how everything is run, the lack of direct access to decision makers that I mentioned before in terms of feedback, because even that comments box gets handled by the mid-tier manager, right? The actual leader is not the one handling that feedback. And how the organization could sometimes be treated as silos. There's not too much cross operational communication. So I think when we are looking at how to treat your organization with more diplomacy, like we do with other nations, I would say most of the critical negotiations often happen right down the hall. It's that organizational statecraft. If you treat your organization like little embassies, right? Your chief legal officer is now the ambassador of liability. Your CFO is the ambassador of financial reality. Just bring them to the table and build that coalition before the crisis hits. Because when we are under some type of emergency risk, etc., you cannot have your lawyers, your tech teams, your public affairs, everybody arguing about priorities for the first time, right? So as a leader, you need to have that connective tissue that I was talking about to be having that common interest and common response for the organizational survival. And I think also effective diplomacy requires a shared language. And I'm going to give an example with the cyber team, for example, right? The language truly matters, but it has to be the language of mission impact. The cyber team might report, we need to sunset this legacy system. To a CFO, that's just technical jargon. But I, as the leader, as the policymaker, it's my job to reframe it and say, this aging system is no longer patchable, and it means our entire supply chain could be frozen for 48 hours, costing us $1 million a day and halting production. When you put it like that, you just shifted the tone from a very technical jargon to something that another person in the team is like, oh, I get it. I can handle this issue. So you're creating, through that diplomacy, shared language, you're creating what I call a shared reality within the organization. And to be honest, a shared language of risk, because oftentimes I'm attending meetings where the same acronym, gets thrown, if you don't know the acronym, they give you the glossary list and, learn it for the next meeting. I'm like, guys, you need to focus on mission language, right? That is the language that I want to speak. Mission impact. Don't give me the tech, don't give me the operational, don't give me the logistics, the money, the budget, the legal. Let's talk a common language where we all know where we stand. I think that's the importance of diplomacy within the organization, that and those hallway conversations.
Absolutely. And a true leader that is invested in their leadership now, if it's somebody running around just, with the title and throwing out orders is different. But a person that it really values their leadership, really values the impact, takes on the responsibility and ownership of communicating effectively, even if it's, the purple squad, right? And by purple, I mean everybody,
Yes.
Army, Navy, everybody, and still be able to take the message, deliver the message, and have the same impact, even if it's cross boundaries. And that is truly a sign of a leader that's invested in the people, because he's not doing that, or she's not doing that for her own sake. It's for the sake of the mission, as you have just mentioned. And so, yeah, very valuable insight there for sure. And as geopolitical tension and information warfare continue to rise, which we see it, what role should values based leadership and ethical decision making play in policy development and execution this next year?
I'll put my Intel background hat here for a second to answer this, but because in my view, this plays a crucial role, because the central goal of our adversaries in the information space is to create moral ambiguity. They love it. They want to sow division and convince the world that there is no difference between their action and ours. So our most powerful and asymmetric advantage in this fight is trust. Trust is the currency of alliances, is the foundation of international legitimacy, and it's the shield against disinformation. But trust, we cannot surge it in a crisis. We must build it over time through consistent ethical action. So I think we must embed ethics into policy design from the very beginning. And in fact, I'm very much interested in working that aspect with AI at the moment. And we have to red team our policies, not just for operational risk, but for ethical risk. And we have to ask ourselves, okay, how will this action be perceived by our allies, but also by our adversaries? Does this action reinforce our values, or just creates a new vulnerability for an enemy to exploit? So unfortunately, right at this moment, I may not be in a policy-making, decision-making position where I can implement this philosophy, but I was in the past, where the ethical aspect was crucial, because you don't want to give your enemy that already advantage where they create that moral ambiguity. I also think it's important for the leader to communicate very clearly the ethical intent. We cannot shift that responsibility to the operators on the front lines. We need to have their back, and we need to know, they need to know that how they achieve the mission is just as important as achieving it. We need to empower that, and we cannot shift that decision, I think, to them in the field. And finally, just create a culture of ethical dissent safety, I would say, where a person on the ground is oftentimes the first time or the first person to see a moral hazard. So we need them to feel safe raising a red flag without any type of fear of retaliation. Again, from my point of view as a leader, I don't see that as any type of challenge to my authority or to my title. I think it's most critical part of the feedback loop to prevent a tactical disaster, to raise that flag and say, hey, I'm here in the front, I'm seeing this challenge.
And as a leader, you know that the trust is one of the most valuable things you have in order to complete a mission. And if your people can trust the fact that you are allowing them the opportunity to say, hey, I see something here that we may have missed,
Mm-hmm.
bring it up. By all means, look it over. If it's not valid, then you may be able to
Right.
say, oh, well, this is why that looked that way, or this is why you may have perceived this, but this is what it is, and have those dialogues. Don't be afraid of that, because some of the things, like you just said, are seen on the ground level. When you're up at
Right.
policy making and right, there's a lot that you miss from what's actually happening. And those people on the ground, those people that are closest to the mission, are the ones that can really tell you how those policies are either being perceived or being executed. Because sometimes policy is not the issue, it's the
Right.
implementation and the execution of it where we kind of go
Right.
awry. But
And that's why I'm great at writing policy, Enrique, because I've been operational, right? I've been there. So I by no means ever take any type of, feedback as, challenge to my authority. That is exactly what leaders need to know.
absolutely. Now, we may be talking about policy, we may be talking about diplomacy, and some leaders are saying, "No, I'm not even at that level." But I remember
Right.
prior to us chatting, we had mentioned, or at least I mentioned, that everybody has a role, right? So whether you're the one writing and influencing the way this thing is structured, whether you're the one printing out the documents and distributing it among the command, or you're the ones that actually putting foot to ground and executing, we all have our place in policy. And so for emerging and mid-level leaders, what is one mindset shift you believe is essential for effectively harnessing diplomacy and policy
Mhm.
as leadership tools rather than viewing them as constraints?
Probably moving from a mindset of what does this policy require me to do, to just ask, what was this policy intended to achieve? It may seem like a very subtle change in the wording, but it changes everything, because the first question, what does this policy require me to do, makes you a passive recipient of rules, just a task executor, right? The second question, what was this policy intended to achieve? It transforms you into an active problem solver and genuinely a stakeholder in the mission. So when you approach policy and bureaucracy as just a set of constraints, your only options are compliance or complaint. But when you start from a place of understanding the strategic intent behind the policy, your options really multiply. You can now see when the rules as written are actually getting into the way of the goal as intended. It's more of they become a map rather than just follow this path. I also think that it's probably a good approach, instead of just focus on, this is bad policy or it's badly written, etc., to be more proactive and just use diplomacy to build a coalition where you can shift the policy. So instead of saying, the way this is reading, X, Y, and Z is creating this friction, just again, go back to not approaching policy as a rule book. It's a statement of intent. The moment you make that shift, I can assure, the policy is no longer a set of shackles. It's a roadmap and it's something that helps you navigate the terrain and to use your expertise better to achieve that mission goal.
And that's a wonderful shift in the question. And even beyond policy, folks, even beyond what's written and structured, right? We refer to ours in the military as commander's intent. What is that? What was the intent for
Mm-hmm.
this policy? But even greater than that, I'll give you an example. I was on a mission. We were about to be deployed. I was part of this rapid response, how we would normally say, and that just meant that within 24 hours we were on a C-130 in a different country doing a different thing, right? So even in those situations, I was at the Senior Enlisted Academy and I was doing a country brief, and in that country brief, I decided to kind of pick one of the countries I knew I was going to. But I found out so much about the relationship aspect of our countries and why we were doing things. I was able to capture that, package it for the crew, and this had never been done. I had never heard from a leader this approach, and I took it back. Once I delivered my findings, this whole unit, this whole crew was like all in. And all I did was bring home the true why behind what we were doing, changed everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so, leaders out there listening, you're viewing this, do your homework, invest in your leadership to provide for your people the true why behind the thing, and you will see a dramatic change in mindset, in approach, and even support. So, thank you for bringing that up, and it just took me back to that. Now, we could talk about diplomacy policy
Yes.
all for a long time because it's something that we love and we have been part
Mm-hmm.
of. But for the audience listening, what do you have coming up, or where can the viewer or the listener follow you or support you in what you're doing?
Sure. So the best way to connect with me, I think it's still LinkedIn. You can always find me and in different cyber defense intel summits and conferences. I'm always open and willing to participate in those speaking and media engagements and conferences. But I think short term to midterm for me, there was an opportunity which I'm still considering to start writing a book. The project is very interesting because it's not just leadership or tell me your personal story. It has more to do with pretty much what I've shared today with you, having these conversations of efficiency and approach problems in a different lens. So it wouldn't be a strictly leadership kind of book. It would be a more, deployable to the field approach.
Outstanding. Well, I encourage you to write that book because how many Spaniard female in your
Bilingual, yes.
positions, have been able to do so, Rose. So
Thank you.
regardless how many people have written books, your book is not out there yet. And I'm willing to buy it and share it and get people to do so as well. Well, folks, it has been a great time speaking with Raquel. I hope that the information that was shared is something that you can use wherever you are in leadership. Now, today's episode is sponsored by the Global Trends Magazine, the Outlier Project, Bone Frog Coffee, Castle and Compass Adventures, Ascend Meditations, Chop AI, and Boomcaster. If you've enjoyed this episode and learned something interesting about the topic covered today, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and let us know by leaving a comment. And tune in next week for another episode where we dissect leadership from another angle. And as we like to end the show, success to you.